Okay, I think we can get started. Thank you for your patience as we let everyone join us today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, The Role of the UN in Realizing Inclusivity. This webinar is part of the UN Talks seminar series that is co-hosted by the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation and UNDP Sweden. And the aim of the UN Talks initiative is to contribute to critical reflections and a deeper understanding of the UN in Sweden. My name is Sigrid Gruner, and I'm Program Director for Peace Building and Sustaining Peace at the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation. And I'm pleased to be joining you from New York today. It's really a pleasure to be here for this very important conversation and to share with you some findings from our recent work on this topic. This is an area that the foundation has been engaged in for several years that we see is really at the heart of so many critical issues. We see that in the past years, there has been greater recognition of the importance of inclusion in development and peace building, not only in processes, but also in the outcomes of these processes. When we speak about development gains and peace dividends, that these must be shared by diverse groups across a broad spectrum of society. We have the international human rights frameworks with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at the center that enshrine the civil and political rights, as well as the economic, social, and cultural rights for all persons without discrimination. We have the 2030 Agenda and its 17 Sustainable Development Goals, many of which highlight specifically the importance of inclusivity, such as inclusive education, industrialization, gender equality, safe and resilient settlements, and of course, Goal 16, which is one that many point to, that highlights the importance of peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. We also have the Sustaining Peace Resolutions of 2016 that underscore the importance of inclusivity as being really key to advancing national peace building processes. We have the Women, Peace and Security Agenda and the Youth, Peace and Security Agenda that emphasize the imperative of to ensure full participation of women and youth. We also have in 2018, the seminal UN World Bank study, Pathways to Peace, that in making the business case for prevention emphasizes that the best way to prevent societies from descending into crisis and conflict is to invest in inclusive and sustainable development. And yet we know that despite this policy recognition and these commitments at the international and global level, that the reality that we see at the country level is not there, that there is a great disparity. And we know that this has only been further exacerbated by the COVID pandemic and the responses to it, where we have seen growing inequalities, an increase in human rights abuses, shrinking space for civil society, and so on. We know that the UN has a critical role to play in supporting national actors in realizing their commitments to inclusive peace and development. And this really was the impetus for the study that we'll be discussing today, was to see how have the normative frameworks and the agreements that have been put in place over the past years and decades, how have they helped to ensure greater inclusivity at the country level, and what more is needed. And we're very pleased to have some very distinguished speakers with us here today to share with us their experience, their knowledge, their insights, and also some of the challenges around this work, which are very real. So just a few housekeeping items then before we get started. This webinar is being recorded and will be broadcast after the event. Participants may provide reflections and submit questions via the chat function at the bottom of your screen. We will try to address as many of these as we can, including some that have been submitted in advance through the registration process. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to all of them given the limited time, but we will try to be as comprehensive as possible. We will start this webinar with a brief presentation of the study that I was referring to previously. And that will be followed by an interactive discussion with the speakers, and then going into a question and answer segment. The webinar is going to be moderated by my colleague, Sarah Smith, who is Program Manager for Peace Building and Sustaining Peace at the Foundation. So I'm very pleased to be able to hand over to you now, Sarah.
Thank you, Sigrid. And thank you for everyone who is joining the conversation. We're really pleased that you could be with us today to listen to the experiences and perspectives from all four of our speakers. And joining us today, we have Angelo Cardona, who is the co-founder and president of the Ibero-American Alliance for Peace. We also have Jessica Fayeta, who is the UN resident coordinator in Colombia, as well as Maria Jose Torres Macho, who is the UN resident coordinator in Malawi. And then finally, but certainly not least, Ingela Andersson is joining us today, who is project manager on inclusive peace processes with the My Right organization based in Stockholm. Before turning to our speakers for their reflections, I want to provide some framing for the discussions and for some of the considerations that I'll be presenting throughout the discussion. As Sigrid mentioned, this is a project that the Foundation has been working on for a couple of years now. And we focused in our study on 4 normative frameworks: the 2030 Agenda, the Sustaining Peace Agenda, which underscores inclusivity as key to advancing peace processes, as well as the Women, Peace and Security Agenda and the Youth, Peace and Security Agenda. But as Sigrid, of course, underscored, these are not the only frameworks that really highlight the importance of inclusivity. And the discussions today won't necessarily be focused on these frameworks as such, but more so the role of the UN in really advancing inclusivity at the country level. In the Foundation study, we looked at 4 country case studies: Colombia, Sri Lanka, Jordan, and the Gambia. And in collecting experiences and perspectives from these countries, the Foundation, working with consultants, conducted interviews, focus group discussions with civil society and UN staff. We also conducted validation consultations in each of the 4 country case studies to present some of the initial findings collected through interviews and focus group discussions, and to facilitate a conversation between civil society and UN on what is needed to really advance inclusivity at the country level. So the first finding that we'll discuss today has to do with something that I think came up in all 4 of the country case studies, and is really the need to ensure more diverse and meaningful engagement. And while the UN has certainly made important strides in the engagement of civil society, including through consultations with civil society, both as input to internal UN processes, as well as national processes, and conducting assessments and studies on inclusivity and exclusion. There's a lot more work that needs to be done to identify and reach out to those that are most vulnerable to exclusion. And these include thinking about practical dimensions, including what language is being used, who has access to roads, the timing of consultations, etc. Those interviewed and spoken to as part of the study also highlighted that the engagement with civil society still tends to be very much tokenistic, and that engagement is still very much with the same individuals who tend to be those who are more elite, more educated, those working in the capital. And while there are efforts to have consultations with civil society, there is sometimes a lack of follow-up from these consultations, and that there really is a need to have continued engagement with civil society, both before, during, and after the consultation, to ensure more meaningful engagement. So all in all, I think this really underscores the importance of creating equal partnerships with civil society. So to turn to our speakers, I want to first turn to Angelo to ask Based on the reflections that I just shared from the foundation study, what are some of your experiences or the experiences of your colleagues in engaging with the UN? And what concrete steps do you feel are needed for the UN to move beyond the tokenistic inclusion to more meaningful and diverse partnerships?
Thank you very much. First to the Hammarskjöld Foundation and to the United Nations Development Program in Sweden. My engagement with the UN, I have had the opportunity to speak at the United Nations headquarters and Geneva office about the human rights situation in Colombia, the implementation of the peace agreement, and particularly the killing of social leaders in Colombia, which is one of the main issues that we face here. And young people in recent months and years are getting as well being part of this population who is being assassinated in the country. Also, I'm part of the Youth for Disarmament initiative of the United Nations Office for Disarmament First. And I'm also part of the Global Coalition of Youth, Peace and Security, which is a global coalition of the United Nations and civil society organizations. As part of the efforts in this last group, I co-founded the regional team for Youth, Peace and Security, the regional coalition in Latin America for Youth, Peace and Security, and also the national coalition in Colombia for Youth, Peace and Security. In this national coalition, we have the members from the United Nations Population Fund, which is pretty much the United Nations team that has been working with us, along with us, to foster the implementation of the United Nations Youth, Peace and Security agenda in the country. So in regards to your second question about what will be concrete steps that the United Nations could implement in order to engage in meaningful inclusivity at the country level, I'll say most of the programs that are carried out currently by the United Nations, I just really speak about the youth, which is my main topic, and the youth, peace and security resolutions particularly. Youth come to appear in the agenda only in the implementation process. So the United Nations prepare all the project or the initiative, and youth come to be part of that initiative once it comes to the implementation. So to me, if we want to have a meaningful inclusion, youth should be at the first step of the project. It should be on the creation, the implementation, and the conclusion of the project. That will translate to me a meaningful inclusion, and that could be a very first step.
Thank you, Angelo, for really underscoring the importance of engaging civil society and particularly young people in both the design, implementation, and the monitoring and evaluation of projects and programs. So I want to turn now to Jessica and Maria. You've heard a little bit from Angelo of his experiences of engaging with the UN. And I'm wondering if you could maybe share some good practices from both Colombia and from Malawi, respectively, in how the UN has worked to meaningfully engage with a broad and diverse spectrum of society, and what is needed to really strengthen partnerships with civil society and to go beyond this tick in the box exercise. So maybe we can start with Jessica first, and then Maria.
Thank you very much, Sarah and Sigrid, and certainly for including us and inviting us to this important session. And of course, my best to Angelo and Maria Jose for sharing this platform. Looking in Colombia, there's of course the voice of the civil society is very important, especially around the conflict and the peace accord. And the UN system in Colombia has actually made enormous efforts. And I agree with Angelo, that there's a lot more that we can do, and we're certainly striving for that. But I think we have some important results and practices to show, and I want to just say 3 of them. For instance, in the implementation of the peace accord, and I would say that that goes even beyond in the negotiations themselves of the peace agreements. It was actually the UN who made who enabled that the voice of the civil society, in particular the voice of the territories and the voice of the victims and the women, are actually heard and included in shaping the vision of the peace agreement, and in fact in shaping the vision of development at the territorial level, as well as so only women and ethnic organizations. And now in our new development cooperation framework, we actually have adopted the concept of no one left behind, because in a country of a high middle income like Colombia, you have these very deep inequalities. So we see ourselves as that our value added is actually going for the most left behind, for those, and that very much is by giving representation to civil society. Another important, now going into the implementation of the peace accords, one thing that we have done is actually we have supported that in the communities are included in the planning, in the monitoring of public policies. And for instance, we supported a bottom-up exercise that led to the formulation of the development plans, or territorial development plans, PEDETs as they're called in Colombia, that were established in the peace agreement. And we supported an exercise that where 200,000 people from the territories participated in shaping these plans. So this is an important, I think, an important example that we have. And finally, I want to mention also that in our multi-partner trust fund for sustaining peace in Colombia, which is an instrument that has funded a lot of the initiatives for the implementation of the peace accords, we have specifically designated a window for NGOs. So 40% of this fund, which so far has implemented about $170 million, 40% of these resources are actually implemented by civil society organizations. The steering committee of this fund has a civil society representative, and there are projects that are specifically aimed at supporting civil society, specifically victims associations and women associations. So this is some of the examples that we have done. So far, we have just with this fund, we have supported more than 500 civil society organizations that are benefiting from this fund.
Thank you, Jessica, for highlighting those examples. And I think certainly in the Foundation's study, that was very clear that I think particularly women's organizations really were very supportive of the role that the UN has played in raising women's voices with government, but that there seemed to be a lot more work that needed to be done around youth, peace, and security, which is not surprising given that it is a much younger resolution, and is the case, I think, in most countries. And also thank you for raising the importance of financing, and hopefully that's something that we can get to later on in the conversation in terms of how financing can also help strengthen inclusivity. But I'll turn now to Maria for examples from Malawi in how the UN is engaging civil society, and reflections on how the UN can move beyond the tokenistic engagement.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody. Thank you, Sarah and Sigrid, for having us, and obviously big warm hug to Angelo and Jessica. And I was really very attentively listening to Jessica, because I so happened to be in Colombia in some of the experiences that she was talking about. So absolutely, I can give my own personal testimony on how we engage with all those groups. So back to Malawi, I think I would like to use an example that is very close to the chest of the SDG agenda, something that we are trying to do that is quite of business unusual, that is the implementation of a Spotlight initiative. It is a work that brings together 4 agencies of the UN, UN Women, UNICEF, UNFPA, UNDP, and the associated work of UNH, UNHCR, and UNESCO. And actually the whole point in Malawi is about eliminating violence against women and girls. We have realized that this is an accelerator of the whole SDG agenda, actually. And it can only happen if we address the core problem that is behavior change. So it is not just an issue that links to actually, SDGs related to a life free of violence, but it's deeply connected to development, it's deeply connected to culture, it's deeply connected to the lack of opportunities. So the way in which we designed a Spotlight initiative in Malawi was really looking into a joint exercise with the government, but also we have a national reference group that brings together the most important organizations, including some that have been somehow sensitive. LGTB communities in Africa are very sensitive, and I think we managed successfully to involve them during the process of design of the Spotlight. They are an existing group that we actually use as a soundboard. They are also part of our monitoring process. So I think, Angelo, I cannot agree more with you in the sense that we need to, in the UN and through experience from many years, to move from the tokenism. And I think this is a step in that direction. But we also thought that if we want to make behavior change sustain, we had to work with 2 very important stakeholders as well in civil society. One is the traditional authorities. Malawi is a country that has a very important role for chiefs and traditional authorities. They run their authority in parallel to the local authorities that are well established in the constitution, and we have our own development local plans, but the other ones who regulate the normal life of communities and involving them in a conversation around how to prevent harmful practices, how to change the paradigm, and indeed girls do not have to marry when they are 13, that they have to continue in school, and that there is need to involve boys and men in this conversation. I think it is really paying off, I have to say. But we thought that before, we couldn't really achieve reaching the last mile and really engaging those voices that normally we cannot listen to without having the community organizations being part of the implementation. And we have managed to have at least 40% of our implementing partners that are community-based organizations. It's challenging because the level and the capacity sometimes is not exactly the same as other partners that are more international, but I think it's the entire objective of Spotlight is to create a sustainable way of looking into elimination of violence. You cannot do it without those organizations. So I think we are quite determined to get that moving. And something quite special of the Spotlight initiative in Malawi is that we have a media network that is composed by 53 journalists, including community radios. And they are doing things that are absolutely fantastic. I mean, the level of access in Malawi, that is a least developed country, to smartphones connectivity is only 4%. And in rural areas, still today, the most effective way is the radio. So having this group who are indeed very young and very committed, they are even creating soap operas. They are really engaging the communities, doing interviews, bringing the stories of the survivors and dignifying the role of women is being absolutely terrific. So I think just to wrap up, and maybe just one last point, as a result of the work that we are doing also in terms of developing the Africa Initiative for Women Leadership, we have the Young Feminist Network that has been established. And that's one example of young women participating fully in the agenda of gender equality and being part of the results of the Spotlight initiative. So I think for us, this has been, I think we are already initiating the 3rd year of implementation, but we are seeing that in terms of behavior change, men are starting to speak up against violence. We are starting to see elements of sustainability into the implementation. So it's not because we are working together with the European Union and the government and because we have the funding, but we see the appetite to do things differently and we are reaching the last mile. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. It's good to hear examples from another country context that is not included in the Foundation's report. And I think going forward, that needs to be part of the conversation and really raising these examples from various countries and experiences. And I think really you highlighted the importance of contextual analysis and thinking about in each context, what are the groups that really need to be part of the conversation in advancing these questions. So I'll turn now to Ingela to ask if you can maybe share some of the good practices that you have used in your own work or the work of your partner organizations for engaging and partnering with local communities and how these could be adapted by the UN to meaningfully engage persons with disabilities.
Thank you. Well, My Right is the Swedish umbrella organization for the disability movement. And through our member organizations, we always design and implement projects in collaboration with organizations of persons with disabilities in our partner countries. And these OPDs, they operate both at the national and local level and work a lot in their local communities by providing trainings, capacity building to persons with disabilities and their families in order to strengthen their capacity to claim their rights and advocate with local authorities and policymakers in order to remove barriers for this part of the population in terms of accessing education, health, and other services, and basically enjoying the same rights as the rest of the population. We also, as My Right, we of course also work with research, policy, and advocacy. And in that work, we conducted a similar study as you have done, but with a specific focus on inclusion of persons with disabilities and peace building. In this study, we conducted more detailed case studies on two of our partner countries, which are Sri Lanka and Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also a bit smaller case studies, and among this was Colombia included. Our experience was that the UN in some country contexts has a good and established partnership with the OPDs, sometimes provide direct funding to them or use them as stakeholders in needs assessment and for accessing persons with disabilities. But in other contexts, they do not have this relationship. So we found that the UN has made strong improvements in recent years, and it's basically one reason for that is the even younger resolution than the other ones mentioned here, which is the resolution 2475 on the protection of persons with disabilities in armed conflict, and also the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy. So those policy frameworks has really helped to push the agenda within the UN. But we found that in terms of direct support and more stronger engagement and long-term support, it still depends a lot on individual staff's interest and goodwill rather than having a systematized approach. So we found really good examples in some agencies and in some country contexts, but not systematically. So the recommendation is just to continue I think in the same direction as you've been moving in recent years, and to systematize this approach, and also to learn from from the more positive examples. In Colombia, for example, we identified a project implemented by IOM and USAID together with a local OPD, which we found as a really good example, and we have presented it as a case in the report that is available on our website. I can also post it in the chat here. So to learn from the positive experiences in between agencies and across countries would be a good recommendation from us. I think I'll stop there on this question and leave the word to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Ingela, for sharing, and I think some similar findings in your study that the foundation had in our study, in terms of that there are certainly very good examples out there, but that it's not as systematic as we would like. And that I think, one of the things to think about is really the role of UN headquarters in supporting UN country teams and resident coordinators' offices to ensure that this work can go forward. So I will move related to that to the next finding from the Foundation's report that we will discuss today, which is the need for the UN to really be persistent in identifying creative, flexible, and long-term strategies to overcome contextual challenges. In all 4 of the country case studies that we looked at in our study, there were domestic, political, and cultural barriers that make it difficult both for civil society to advance inclusivity, but also for the UN to support civil society in this work. And this can relate to hierarchical, patriarchal structures that make it difficult, for example, for young people and women to participate in decision-making processes. It also relates to resistance from certain governments around certain frameworks where Security Council resolutions, for example, may be seen as not relevant because it's not a conflict or post-conflict country, but where the 2030 agenda, which is kind of a global universal agenda, is seen as more of a kind of strategic entry point for the UN to really push for inclusivity. But of course, there is also the risk that these kind of contextual barriers become an excuse for the UN and for other international actors, certainly not only relevant for the UN, to not really stand up for inclusivity and in particular stand up for human rights, speak up against human rights violations, and promote civic spaces. So turning first to Maria, I'm curious to know what entry points you feel like that there are for resident coordinators' offices and UN country teams to promote inclusion in politically sensitive environments, and what kind of support you feel like you would need from UN headquarters and member states in this regard.
Thank you, Sarah. I think we had quite an interesting experience during the elections. We had elections in Malawi in March 2019, elections that were contested in the courts. And as a result, there were it was tripartite elections. It was to councils, to MPs, parliament, and president. And the contestation was particularly for the presidential elections. And the courts instructed in January 2020 to go again to vote for president. And I think, first of all, just to acknowledge the tremendous maturity, I would say, of the Malawi democracy and the strength of the courts, because they managed really to, in a very sensitive context, to independently rule that the elections should change, should have take place again. And I think in that context, the opposition won, which is an outcome that it was quite remarkable, and it was peaceful. So that's the third element. So the role that we play and continue to play in that context, I think, was what I would like to mention, because in the middle between June 2019 and actually the June 2020, we had a year of protest and political instability and volatility. So I have to say, I am going to speak about work that we did together with UNDP, with UN Women, with the Department of Political Affairs and the Office of the Resident Coordinator, because I think the first entry point was our electoral project. So it's a very technical, very interesting approach, extremely well organized around the Electoral Commission, but also the political parties, independent think tank, CMD, working with the interfaith community forum, that it was a conflict prevention type of mediation setup, and also establishing for the first time in elections in Malawi, something that it was called the Gender Engagement Room, that allowed for real-time monitoring of any violence or incidents affecting women. And that was done with civil society outfit and together with the Malawi Police Service. So that was quite an innovation, if you want to. But I think our entry point became before the elections. So we were solidly in the provision of technical support. The UN has, I think, quite a big of a space in Malawi, and we have always had a very successful engagement with all sectors of society. But we did, as a country team, something that was very interesting. So we sat with every major political party to discuss the SDG agenda. What was the UN about? Just to avoid politicization precisely of our technical assistance, which I think was quite useful, because we had key people in political parties to talk to. And believe me, there were so many instances in which the whole issue became very politicized. So that was excellent. And they could see us as a team. So it was obviously the forefront, and the very visible team was the ones dealing with elections, including the RC. But I think they could also see the WFP, and they could also see UNICEF and UNFPA. And I think that gave them a sense that we were really engaging with broad sectors of society. I think during elections, very crucial was the ability that we had to reach out to headquarters. So your question of who you need in country, who you need to resort to. And there is a very important program that it's, and certainly we are benefiting in Malawi. There is a joint program between the Department of Political Affairs at UNDP, Peace and Development Advisors. The role of that team was absolutely fantastic, together with the work of the Office of the High Commission of Human Rights, because we created a team that was monitoring potential areas of conflict and tension, and then we were trying to use the toolbox to address those. And all the work was done very much behind the scenes. There was a moment in which we needed to pull a high-level visit, and we had a very important visit by the Secretary General Special Representative of the African Union, Hannah Tete, who engaged all political parties when we were in the second vote for the president. And again, that was a combined effort between headquarters, the country team, and the project. We were also able to support some very local efforts to mediate, just behind the scenes again, and reaching out also to the SADC ambassadors. That was absolutely a very interesting aspect of it. And I think this has not ended, obviously, because the whole process revealed that Malawi was lacking a bigger framework for conflict prevention, conflict resolution. And we have engaged, and there is already a bill draft for the Malawi Peace Commission. And it's probably part of what we are going to be doing as part of the governance kind of landscape that really brings together different sectors of the civil. It's an independent commission that is there to really look at the bigger issues. So I think we put together the political side of the engagement in a very discreet manner, providing always the space for the national actors. So we were really very much using the idea of the UN as a convener, but I mean, behind the scenes. We also used the strong capacity of our agencies to create some space through the technical toolbox. And we reach out to different stakeholders. One issue that we are taking forward for the next elections is the difficulty that we had to create meaningful space for political participation of women and young people. So this is something that we are taking forward for the next electoral cycle. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Maria, for I think highlighting the importance of coordination, not only between UN agencies at the country level, but with headquarters and with other actors, including regional organizations in advancing these agendas. Turning to Ingela now. Obviously, you work for a Swedish NGO. So I would be curious to hear your reflections on how Sweden and other member states can support efforts by the UN to advance and support inclusivity at the country level, and specifically of persons with disabilities in particularly sensitive environments. And are there other entry points that your organization, My Right, has been able to build on in navigating some of these contextual challenges?
Well, we had a very, also in the same study as I was referring to previously, we had a very good dialogue with the UN of what they would like to see from their donors. So Sweden and other bilateral donors, in order for them to also strengthen disability inclusion in their programming. And what they requested was, first of all, for these donors to include this as a requirement in project and program proposals, because it's very difficult otherwise for them to prioritize disability inclusion among other pressing issues, other cross-cutting issues, gender, youth, etc. So they would welcome, clearer demands from the donors, and also, of course, it's very important that donors understand the costs of accessibility in the programming. So ensuring the meaningful engagement of persons with disabilities requires budgeting for additional costs in terms of adapting buildings, communication, and all kinds of barriers that persons with disabilities face in participating in many of the activities. It could be transportation. It could also mean bringing an assistant to trainings and conferences, etc. So that was very important and addressed by all UN agencies that we spoke to. In terms of navigating difficult contexts, we looked at challenging political environments where it's difficult to work with national level peace building. So we found in some contexts that the UN has been then able instead to work locally, for example, with conflict resolution at the community level when there is no national level entry point for this. And we found that the UNDP in Ukraine, in those local level conflict resolution activities, had a very good relationship with persons with disabilities. And they used, I think it can be similar to the approach used there in Malawi. They used what they call social cohesion advisors, that help them with needs assessment and context analysis. And among that group of social cohesion advisors, they had ensured that some of them were persons with disabilities, so that they could provide inputs to disability inclusion in the programming. So those were some of the findings from our study. And I think that there are, as I mentioned before, very positive examples of how the UN is navigating these challenging contexts and finding ways of engaging groups that have not been included traditionally in their programming. So I think that it's a matter of scaling up these positive examples and systematizing them.
Thank you, Ingela. And I think, again, for going back to the importance of funding and really making sure that that this is a requirement in project proposals. I know that we're running out of time, but I want to give a chance for Angelo and Jessica to reflect on this as well. So I'll turn to Angelo to reflect maybe a little bit on the barriers that civil society and specifically youth-led initiatives face in Colombia in working and advocating for peace and development. And how does civil society navigate these barriers, and what do you feel like the UN could do to support these efforts?
Thank you. So I think we have identified 4 key issues or key main constraints when it comes to working for peace and development in a context like Colombia. So the first one, I mean, there are amazing projects throughout the country, and there are many of them which are being led by young people, and we see the willingness and the cooperation of the United Nations has been enormous, and I'm a witness of that as I work with them in the implementation of this resolution at the country level. But there is a point which I think is quite important, and the thing is that there are many initiatives, but there is no like a common agenda. There is no a common purpose. So we have young people working around the country, building up their own initiatives, but they do not know each other. There is no like a common vision. So I think if we will be able to gather that common vision, the impact will be enormous. That's one of the main challenges. The second one I'll say is that in terms of the resolutions, the 2250, the 2419, and the 2535, which are the 3 resolutions on youth, peace, and security. Most of the Colombian population, and particularly young people, do not know about these resolutions. So you can't implement something that you do not know. So I think it's quite important also to sort of make like a campaign to teach the population about the resolutions and what are the objectives of such resolutions and what are the responsibilities of the government when it comes to the implementation of these resolutions. The third point will be the security issue. So as we know, I think in Colombia, there are no guarantees to carry out an activism and engage in civil society spaces, in civic spaces. Most of colleagues I work with, most of them have been threatened just for the initiative that they have or the leadership that they represent in their communities. So I feel that there is a big issue of security yet, and unfortunately, I think the government has been slow in responding to that, despite all the pressure that we have issued to them. And the fourth point, which I'll highlight, is the funding these initiatives. Normally, young people do not like structures. So there are so many NGOs that are not legally formed, so they can't access legally to funds. They are informal networks, and this is the way young people like to operate. So we have to find like a sort of a way to fund those initiatives, and I think that's definitely one of the issues, that young people do not know how to access those funds and do not have the capacity to do so. And just as a final comment on this first question is that one of my colleagues in the Youth, Peace and Security National Coalition in Colombia, he was invited to a brilliant effort, I have to say, that made the Colombian government, and along with the United Nations Development Program, they organized a forum, the first symposium on youth, peace and security in Finland, in Helsinki, along with the government of Colombia, the government of Finland, and the government of Qatar. And they brought young people from around the world to share their experiences on youth, peace and security and the implementation at the country level. In that summit, but that time, the then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Carlos Holmes Trujillo, he said that he was going to set up an agenda for Colombia and to engage with young people in order to foster the implementation of this agenda. That was said, it was an amazing effort. When my colleague came back, when we went to speak with the Minister of International Affairs in Colombia, we didn't receive any response. No one was accountable for the words that were said by Carlos Holmes Trujillo. But that time, we tried to speak with Colombia Haven. That didn't happen also. So whilst there are efforts being made, enormous efforts, I think at the time to implement those efforts or to make them a reality, I think there is still a gap. So how the UN could support, I think first, I think the UN could maybe work as a bridge for the civil society and particularly young people to engage with decision makers. I think they could definitely act as a bridge, and maybe they could gather also all those initiatives of young people which are working separately, and they can start to work together towards a common purpose. Maybe the role of the UN there could be as a facilitator or something like that. I mean, the entity that could bring up that space. As a second thing, I think the monitoring of the implementation of the resolutions, they could act as that entity, evaluating and making sure that the government actually is implementing and is being accountable for what they say. So I think that's a second point. Yeah, those I think will be my recommendations in this end.
Thank you, Angela. Jessica, turning to you to respond maybe to what the reflections that Angelo just provided. How can the UN continue to work and support the civil society in Colombia, and what kind of support do you feel like you need from UN headquarters and member states in this regard?
Thank you, Sarah, in very important reflections that I have heard. I want to focus on the moment right now that Colombia is living. As you may have heard or seen in the news, Colombia is going right now through a very difficult time. It's been 1 month of massive protest with high levels of violence and vandalism and blockages to the cities, where we see a lot of the voices of the young people and civil society in the streets. So here, actually, civil society is looking to the UN as an actor to bring to the table the voice of the minorities and the most vulnerable, as we have actually established ourselves as such. So what we have done basically is right now is the whole UN system in Colombia, which is very very large. We have in a way divided ourselves to support this clamor, especially of civil society, but also to balance the table, right? And for instance, what we are the UN verification mission with the Office of the High Commission of Human Rights, they are mediating right now a dialogue between the government and what is called the Strike Committee, which is basically a group of civil society, different groups that are in a committee that are basically making some demands to the government. So that is one part of our work, and of course is again to level the table and to level the conversation. At the local level, several of the UN agencies and taking advantage of our representation of our presence in all over the country, especially in the interior, in the secondary cities. Some agencies are supporting local dialogues, or accompanying, or sometimes are mediating with actors on the street to enable passages of medicines and food. And of course, in that group, we have mostly the humanitarian agencies, WFP to ensure, WFP, FAO to ensure that the food is going through OCHA, and with the use of our local coordination teams. And then what we have realized is that young people who are the ones, and as Angelo said, are not structured, are not necessarily represented or organized in any group, and they are not necessarily attending to some of the dialogues or that the government has called for. So we feel that it's very important that young people are heard, are included, their voices are transmitted, their proposals, they have ideas. So what we have done, and this is UNDP, and we will be going there together, for instance, with UNFPA, but it's right now mostly UNDP, which has made partnership with some universities and with the mayor of Bogota, for instance, to open some platforms that are both virtual and physical in the spaces where young people are right now rallying, to hear them, also to provide them the space to talk among themselves, to discuss among themselves, and to support them in systematizing their proposals, ordering, channeling them to policymakers, translating them into real and concrete programs, but also providing, for instance, the use of technology that is very much for the use of young people to read the ideas that are expressed in social networks, for instance, that are sometimes not collected. So this is something that we are right now in the middle of doing this, because we feel is right now the voices of young people need to be heard, and they have ideas on what exactly is that they need, and they have demands. The other point related to this is that we see also a crisis of representation and leadership of young people, of women, of indigenous people in the representation of the traditional institutions, right? So that's another way that we can help, and we want to help. Certainly, we have done that with women representation in politics, and supporting women organizations, supporting leadership of women, so they can actually accede. And this is an important part that we need to do more with young people, so they can actually be part of the political conversation, be part of the political processes, but also strengthen their own leadership and in participation in this. I would say that as some of the things that we need from headquarters, and from the member states, is that we need to keep investing in strengthening civil society organizations. We have learned that the resources investing in especially civil society organizations that are starting have a direct impact in promoting democracy and empowering leadership and collective construction of civil society and the state and governments in peace, both in peace building, but also in policy making. And in that, one specific and very important request is that we need more flexible mechanisms that allow us to work with organizations that are small, that don't have much experience or recognition, and therefore sometimes they need to be given the opportunity to manage funds, to strengthen. And UNDP, in fact, is very good at doing this, but we need more flexible mechanisms, because sometimes, of course, these are risky undertakings. Sometimes we are talking with very weak institutions, but if we don't give them the opportunity, if we don't accompany them into strengthening their administrative and financial mechanisms, and learning about managing funds, or about making proposals, about how to organize the organic structure of their own organizations, they don't have a chance to be a stronger organization. So I think sometimes our rules and regulations require that we actually make an assessment, and they are very stringent sometimes, and that can only be passed. This assessment can only be passed by a stronger organization. And what we need is the younger, the weaker. UNDP has done a lot of that. We do a lot of that as UNDP, but I think we can do a lot more with more flexibility and understanding from our headquarters. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica, for highlighting these examples. So we will open up to questions from the audience, but as we wait for some of those questions to come in, I did want to turn to a few of the issues raised by our speakers already. Angelo, you mentioned already the importance of that there is a lack of awareness of specifically Resolution 2250 among young people in Colombia, and this is in line with one of the findings of the Foundation's report, that there tends to be a lack of awareness on all of the frameworks, both among civil society, but also within UN staff. And you spoke of the importance of the UN raising awareness of the frameworks and kind of the role that the government has in implementing these. And I'd be curious to hear from many of the other speakers your reflections on this, in terms of to what extent the UN should be focusing on raising awareness of the frameworks, as opposed to focusing more on their substance and implementation. And then we've also heard quite a lot throughout the discussion related to financing, and Jessica, you just highlighted very concretely the need for more flexible funding mechanisms to allow local civil society organizations to implement peace building. And we have a question from the audience that was submitted in advance, in terms of the role of the private sector in engaging on peace building. So I'd be curious to hear from any of the speakers' reflections on how more innovative and flexible, predictable funding can be used to strengthen meaningful engagement of civil society, and specifically, are there examples of working with the private sector? So I'll open up if there's any of the speakers that would like to come in.
I could come in if you like. I completely agree with what Jessica has mentioned about having this flexibility of them to maybe assess the applications for funding. But I do think maybe that will be a little bit hard to do, to be completely honest, because obviously you have to trust, and obviously that will put at risk if maybe this is not a structured organization. So maybe a way I could think of is maybe creating a program, maybe if the UN or any other agency could create a program in which maybe the government or Colombia can teach the young people how to strengthen the organization, how to strengthen financially, how to create or to create a project, and how to legalize the organization. Maybe I think that would be a really good way to strengthen the organization as such. And at the same time, they will have the ability to start applying for funding by themselves. So I think creating that program will be an important step, and maybe could be a first step, I would say. But that will look more like realistic, because I think giving just funds to an organization that's not legalized might be hard. So that's my input there.
Thank you, Angelo. And maybe if I could turn to Jessica and Maria for any reflections on, are there examples from Colombia and Malawi of engaging with the private sector, and how the private sector could support efforts to facilitate inclusivity? and then maybe turn to Ingela on reflections on the global frameworks themselves and raising awareness of them.
Certainly, Sarah. Look, right now we recently published our report, our annual report in Colombia, which I will ask one of my colleagues to perhaps put on the chat. And there we are saying that about right now, 20% of our partners, so that's quite a bit now, is the private sector for the whole entire, UN system in Colombia. And we have engaged with the private sector in several ways, but let me just mention a couple. Last year, with resources from the Peace Building Fund, the Multi-Partner Trust Fund for Sustaining Peace in Colombia launched a first call for proposals for blended finance for private sector partners to invest in projects with social impact in the municipalities most affected by armed conflict. And we put forward a total of $2 million for cooperation resources to co-fund initiatives. And we have been able actually to, these were somewhere around 200,000 to 300,000 per initiative. And we have been able to leverage close to $13 million for that. So about for every dollar that we invested with the Peace Building Fund, we have leveraged $6 from the private sector. And this has been actually very important to, as a very important experiment. We are now going for more sophisticated and larger ventures with that, but I think it has been a very important step in working and financing with private sector to invest in the areas, for instance, of peace building. Another aspect important that we have done is we are now completing, this is with UNDP, what we call the Sdg Mapping. And it's basically a tool to track the contribution of the private sector to the SDGs. And this is actually a very sophisticated tool that we have over 100 companies of the largest in Colombia, but we are aiming to have many more actually to use this tool, but also to enable the country to see what is the contribution and what more can they do as part of the financing of the SDGs in Colombia. Certainly, we see that the private sector increases the impact of interventions and generates investors' confidence in these municipalities by seeing them. And as a last example is, for instance, in the productive projects finance to support the economic reintegration of ex-combatants into civilian life. A lot of it is happening basically through productive projects. The articulation with private sector into value chains, so they can actually not only contribute to the peace building and to the reincorporation of ex-combatants, but also they can actually make their productive projects more sustainable and more viable by buying from them, by also strengthening their own capacities. And this has actually been a very important very important experience, but it has had a positive collateral effect of reconciliation and building trust between the business sector and the ex-combatant and in the communities, and of course to build peace. Right now we are working with the government on what is called the Integrated National Financing Framework. And basically the idea is to understand all possible sources of funding, public and private, to and international cooperation to contribute to our SDGs and policy priorities. And I think certainly we want to reflect that the private sector is not only a big contributor, but can be a lot more to to reach the SDGs in Colombia.
Thank you, Jessica. Maria?
Thank you. I fully agree with Jessica's take on the contribution of private sector. And I mean, the difference between, there are many differences obviously between Colombia and Malawi, but one important one is that we are operating in a least developed country, and we have a tremendous gap between the big companies and what we can call the medium-sized enterprises. And as UN team, we have agreed that this is our top priority to realize precisely what Jessica was defining as the realization of the SDG agenda. We need the private sector working towards profit, but also to social impact. And this is what, as the UN, we are doing. We have gotten a very interesting proposal that is a joint program between UNDP, UNCDF, and FAO. Called Build Malawi, that is intending to really support. It's a blended capital, so similar to what Jessica was explaining with the Peace Building Fund for Colombia. And it is really intended to create and support kind of 3,000 new sustainable jobs, more than 45,000 small jobs into the supply chain. And I think the work that we are doing right now, because precisely the fund gave us catalytic funding from New York, and we are mobilizing also other type of investments, including private sector. And it's really to work on financial inclusion. It is extremely tough for a woman in Malawi or a young person to go to a bank and get a loan, even if they have the most terrific idea. And we have been working already with something that is called the Growth Accelerator. This is a project by UNDP with one of the most interesting national incubators, MHub, to identify those young innovators who had ideas and no way that they are going to get the funding. And that's exactly the effort that we are trying to do. So capture the young innovators, see how we can get closer to finances, but also support the small and medium-sized enterprises with this build. And the reason for doing that, and we know that business is business and they need to have return on investment at least, but I think it is also making sure that the social impact is fully assessed. And that's, I think, our role. And that's the appeal also to member states who really want to partner in places that you really need to work very hard for those small and medium-sized enterprises, for these innovators who have even no access to internet, if you want to help them really to get this first level of action. And I think we are really quite excited about this opportunity, but absolutely capital and very important for you in Malawi, the private sector.
Thank you, Maria. So I'll turn to Ingela now for any reflections on the importance of raising awareness of these global frameworks. And then we will wrap up with some final reflections from each of the speakers. So Ingela.
Thanks. Well, on funding, I could also say, and also regarding what Angelo was pointing out in terms of funding for smaller youth organizations. I know that there are some international INGOs, for example, Search for Common Ground, who has a program similar to what you were requesting, where they focus on strengthening the organizational structure and the capacity of youth organizations in accessing funding, and also building networks, because it's much easier if these small organizations come together in a bit larger networks in terms of managing resources, etc. And in that sense, I think that the UN also, in terms of how they support organizations of persons with disability, to my experience, have taken that approach. So supporting the national umbrella organization, which unites then the whole disability movement in a specific country, rather than supporting each small organization who might not have the full capacity to manage those funds. So that could be at least a first step forward in terms of financing. When it comes to translating these difficult frameworks to the local needs and interests. What we do is that, or our experience at least, is that persons with disabilities have a rather, I mean, at least organizations of persons with disabilities have a rather strong knowledge of the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, for example, which is a much older framework, while the more newly adopted frameworks, of course, still they need a lot of training and to help to review and translate these and see how they can advocate for the implementation at the national and local levels. But we try to do that through training and capacity building of our partners, who in turn then work with training at the community level to reach out to all of their members. One key challenge, though, when it comes to engaging persons with disabilities is, making sure that these documents are available to persons with different types of disabilities. So it's important to make trainings and seminars and webinars like this one accessible through sign language and easy to read materials. It could be important to share speeches and presentations in advance if participants have, to allow for participants with disabilities to prepare in order to participate and engage meaningfully in these types of events and more of local level trainings as well. So meaningful engagement of persons with disabilities often requires some additional efforts from the UN and other international actors. So that would be a strong recommendation to make sure that the information is always accessible to all types of disabilities.
Thank you, Ingela, for those reflections, and certainly I think going back to some of the discussion earlier on in terms of thinking about those structural barriers to engagement, and thinking about what can the UN and other actors do to really make sure that civil society and diverse actors are able to access these kinds of conversations and spaces. So my colleague Marika has shared a link to the survey, which we would appreciate all participants to fill out before the end of the session or after the close of the session. But I will turn to, as kind of to close off the session, to each of the speakers for some final reflections. And based on the discussions today and what you have heard from the other speakers, what do you feel is the #1 priority for advancing UN efforts to promote inclusivity at the country level? And then for Jessica and Maria, there is actually one question from the audience that I think hopefully will require just a very brief response in terms of, are there any UN publications or guidance on how municipalities can work successfully with inclusivity? So perhaps if there are any resources there that you could share. So I will turn first perhaps to Angelo for any final reflections on the #1 priority for advancing UN efforts.
Thank you. I'll say the #1 priority will be dialogue, a lot of dialogue. And well, I know the context of Colombia is not easy. So I think the United Nations has been making an incredible effort in the country, quite successful actually, according to the latest figures. So #1 priority will be to foster that dialogue. And I would like to invite Jessica to maybe coordinate a meeting either in Bogota or with the National Coalition on Youth, Peace and Security, and see how we can work together to advance the implementation of the agenda in Colombia. We want to see and be perceived as partners, and we will be here to cooperate in that. Just put in the resources, put in the young people who is currently working on it. So that will be my main recommendation.
Thank you, Angela. And I guess I'll turn directly to Jessica then for your final reflections.
Yes, on just a quick answer on the request from the audience. I will see we can make it available through the foundation, but some work that we have done with local governments on how to align their planning and budgeting instruments to the SDGs, and have actually worked also with the National Department of Statistics on how to measure SDGs at the local level and strengthen the statistical capacities of municipalities. So I will share that. I think some of my colleagues are connected. We may not have them immediately available, but we can make them available through the foundation. And as my final reflections, I would say that right now in the challenging context that Colombia is living, especially in the presence of social unrest, it's very important for us not only to facilitate and promote dialogue among different stakeholders, and especially to have the voice of civil society heard, but it will require from us a deep understanding on the needs and the social on their needs, on their demands, and the socioeconomic inequalities that are leading to this this unrest, among other reasons. Civil society organizations, whether those are at the grassroots levels or the larger ones, are important partners to help us reach the most left behind populations. And we are still leaving some behind. For instance, I feel that we don't work enough with people with disabilities or with young people, and there's a clamor right now in the streets, especially on their needs in generating employment and income generation opportunities. And I would say that this is basically, it should be our main, and it is actually our main priority right now to find. And this is also through formal and informal citizen engagement that we need to hear and enable their voices, but also to help them translate and channel their ideas and their proposals and their demands into real, into concrete public policy formulations, programs that actually will represent a solution right now to their demands. And this has to be done not only in the urban, even though this is mostly urban movements, but basically we are also, should not forget the rural people that are also perhaps needing, and they don't have a way to express their voices right now. I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jessica. I'll turn to Ingela next for a final brief reflection on the #1 priority, and then to Maria.
#1 priority. Well, for the UN, I think that our #1 recommendation from our study is to apply a twin track approach to disability inclusion in the programming, which means that the rights of persons with disabilities are mainstreamed in all programs, and also provide targeted support to some extent, in a very similar way as we've been advancing the participation of women in programming. So both mainstreaming and targeted support is very important, and also to make use of the expertise of organizations of persons with disability in terms of how to access and reach this target group, and what is needed in terms of adaptation of the activities for ensuring meaningful participation. So that would be the #1 recommendation.
Thank you, and I think that's very important when talking about youth as well, that it's mainstream throughout the UN's work, and that there is not necessarily one UN agency who holds that agenda, but that really the work of all UN agencies is important to advancing the youth, peace, and security agenda. Maria, I'll turn to you for final reflections.
Yes, no, I cannot agree more with the previous speakers, with Angelo, Ingela, and Jessica on a number of things. And I'm going to refer to a particular experience that I think in my time of Malawi possibly was one of the most, the ones that really touched you. So we used the UN at 75, that it was this global framework for consultations and reach out to countries to do something that it was very interesting. And we did that as UN country team. And we had several dialogues. And one was with young people, and the way we captured young people opinions was using your report. There is a platform that UNICEF uses on the phones to really have a number of answers. So we captured 30,000 people that, for the case of Malawi, with the little connectivity, was quite record. And then we also promoted a dialogue with the universities, and young people were so enthusiastic about the big issues of the 21st century, so about peace and security, what they wanted to see happening in terms of climate, gender empowerment. And it was very clear that they didn't have in Malawi a way to express what they wanted to see happening. And that was done also with the Minister of Information. So he was also very impressed and said, well, yeah, this is something that we need to do. Then another dialogue that we hosted, that was the last one, was with persons with disabilities. So Ingela, to your point of how consulting them, and that was with the minister that in the context of Malawi has the portfolio on persons with disabilities, gender ministry and minister. And it was the first time that she was having a dialogue with all those organizations, facilitated with the UN, and making such a good practical contribution. So nothing very high level. Yes, it's all in the context of the Convention of the Persons Living with Disabilities, but actually was very concrete. And we had also brought some of those groups that were representing persons with, like hearing impairment or visual impairment, that were extremely well articulated. And this is captured in our UN at 75. And that vision that involved young people, that involved women, the communities, persons with disability, we handed over to the National Planning Commission as they were finalizing Vision 2063 for Malawi. So that was a concrete role that we played, that it was really connecting the voices to a different planning process. Now looking into us, and I think back to the priorities, dialogue by all means. Second is the issue of how you transform that in concrete actions, right? Because it's great, we all agree, but then at the end of the day, you want to see targets, as you said. So we have rolled out in Malawi the disability scorecard. That's something that it has been promoted by the Secretary General office. And we have now, I just sent it today, actually, the revised program of action for UN Malawi in inclusion of disability. And that has very concrete targets also in programming accessibility. And this is a lot of work that has been done thanks to the capacity of our human rights advisor. We have a colleague with a disability in the RCO that has also been part of that team. And I think this is, again, and the third point is we can have the frameworks, we can have the plans, but if we don't have the flexible funding, it's very difficult. So it's an appeal to our member states and donors to really use I would say the pool funding, and we have one in Malawi, the Sdg Acceleration Fund, to allow us to be a bit more flexible. Because when there are good ideas coming, and we can articulate that with clear monitoring frameworks, etc., but we need to be given that space to create precisely that, either is the supporting the capacity, but also on the implementation. So I will leave it there, but I think it's really a fantastic conversation. We are starting on it, I think, with humility, just starting to do it, but I think it's really something that we need to pursue as UN teams.
Thank you, Maria, and to all the other speakers for, I think, providing a very good overview and summary of the discussions and really highlighting the role of the UN as a convener and the importance of the UN really raising the voices of civil society with government, and of course the question of funding, we always come back to that. So thank you for all the speakers today for sharing your reflections, and to all the participants who have joined the call and who have submitted questions. So on behalf of the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation and UNDP Sweden, we'd like to thank you and wish you a good evening, a good rest of the day, morning, wherever you are. Thank you so much.